All right, so today the presentation is not going to be like super long or anything. So this is about one of the recent projects that I've been working on. It's kind of an extension of a previous project, just like a smarter way of extending the previous project. At least that's what I think. So I would start the presentation, and the name of the presentation, as you can see, is called Mixture of Experts for Human Activity Recognition. Now, before I begin the presentation, let me just say something about this mixture of experts. So essentially, mixture of experts is a technique that has been adopted from ensemble learning. So if you have multiple models that you usually have in an ensemble, then mixture of experts is a meta learning procedure where you kind of learn how to smartly combine these models. Now I can actually start talking about time series data. So this is a very simple representation, and those who have attended my presentations before already kind of are familiar with this particular diagram. So here, let's say I'm showing accelerometer recordings coming from a sensor device, and each of these black points that you can see in this time series graph represent a single reading from an accelerometer, and they are represented as A1, A2, A3, A4, etc. And if we are talking about a time series classification problem, then usually for each of this recorded accelerometer point, there is an annotation available. And let's say we call those like labels L1, like it can be L2, L3. So of course, like the first two can be L1. And just as a disclaimer, in the field that I usually work with, like human activity recognition, usually the labels, they don't change like every readings, which you can imagine, because these accelerometer readings, they're recorded at between, or the sampling period of this accelerometer point is probably like 20 milliseconds. So it's very unlikely that you will switch, let's say, a particular activity which you are performing immediately in 20 milliseconds. This change can occur if, for example, this switch of the activity that I'm talking about happens after, let's say, a prolonged sequence of performing one of the activities. So essentially these are, but the crux of this particular diagram, at least the top half of it, is to show that each of these accelerometer points are associated with an annotation. Now, in a human activity recognition, or let's say for a time series classification problem, you are posed with a question which is of the following nature. So given a sequence of time, let's say 1 second or 2 seconds, you will be asked what you were performing for that particular period of time. And for activity recognition, it will be like human activities. But for example, it can be also a financial forecast data for time series. And in that case, you will be asked like a different question about, I don't know, like maybe to digress a stock, not to digress, but since we're talking about classification, maybe to determine, let's say, the goodness of a particular stock or something like that. And now, based on the domain of the problem, we have to define this particular time period T for which we are going to ask the question. So for human activity recognition, you'll be asked, what were you performing for the last 1 second? And maybe for, let's say, some data which is coming from the financial domain, we'll ask what was the goodness of this particular stock for over the last 6 months, and then how it changed and so on. So this T can really vary across domains and across problems. And hence this T is quite a vital parameter for this time series, classification or whatever kind of time series data that we are dealing with. Now, once we are given this data, and let's say we want to classify, let's talk about human activity recognition, because that's what the main domain that I'm working with. So basically, if you want to classify or do a human activity recognition, you have to reformat this data in a certain way so that you can feed it to let's say machine learning models or systems. And since you are asked for a particular instance of time, this data has to be reformulated using this representation T. What you do is very simple. You just simply extract a sequence of time series recordings for each of these temporal period T, and we call for, in our work, we usually call this extracted samples a temporal sequence. And so essentially for the whole time series data, you can extract multiple temporal sequences which are represented as rows of these matrices, and against each row you assign a label. So instead of assigning a label against each point, you just simply translate this procedure and assign a label against each temporal sequence. And now you can already recognize that this can be easily fed to a a single model, which can be a machine learning or a deep learning system. But the vital part was to show you that this window length is like a really important parameter, which helps you answer the question about your classification problem. Now, if you think about a human activity recognition problem, then it can be, let's say, a data set or can be composed of a range of different activities, which can be like running, walking, vacuum cleaning, ironing, etc. And in the left-hand side, I show you the different graphs, that accelerometer graph in one axis that can arise from each of these activities. So as you can see that running has a very clear pattern which can be captured by eyes, and so does walking. The running is this blue one and the walking is the orange one. But for the other activities which are, let's say, a bit more harder in a time of capturing like, you know, visibly with naked eyes from the time series data, are ironing and vacuum cleaning. And as you can see, like for this red and this green line, it's a bit hard, at least with our visual perception, to identify certain temporal patterns. But it's not like, you know, so the machine learning models are there to actually use even this data to identify temporal patterns within this particular, where a temporal pattern is not evident. So we don't need to worry about that. But what we really need to worry about is the fact that how we are going to present this data to the machine learning system. And how we are going to present is what I have shown you earlier, like using like a time period T, we are going to present this data to the machine learning, let's say, classifier or the deep learning classifier. Now the suboptimality lies in the fact that for all the activities which has very different temporal patterns in a standard human activity recognition model, you actually present it with a single time window. And this is where we have a problem, because as it is very much evident that this single size, like, you know, one size fits all doesn't work for all the different class of activities that can be there in a data set. And this is also empirically evident from an experiment that we did. So we trained 5 different models with 5 different time windows. And as we can see, each of these models are performing differently in different activities, which further consolidates the fact that this time period with which we train a particular, with which we extract the temporal sequences to train a particular model is very vital and is heavily dependent on the activities which you're performing. So as we can see, this model 1, which is trained with, let's say, which is trained with temporal sequences that are extracted with time period T1, are performing not very good in this rope jumping activity. But let's say this model 5, which is with time period T5, is performing very well. However, there are some other class of activities where, like, you know, this first model performs better than this 5th model. And hence, it proves this fact that we cannot like stick to one single time period where there is a range of different activities to consider from. And this is kind of the background for one of the previous work which you already published. And what we did do in this work is essentially, instead of sticking to one particular time period, we consider a range of different time periods, which are called the window lengths. And using this different window lengths, we extract different temporal sequences from the same input, the same raw time series signal. And since we have extract different type of inputs, we train different models. And then finally, what we do is we simply average out this, like the output that are coming out of this model. So essentially, there's an ensemble setup that helps us to capture a much better representation of our predictive response. And this results or improves the performance for different data sets and of human activity recognition for the experiments that we did. And of course, since these models are not really dependent on the type of architecture that you're choosing from, you can choose any type of neural network architecture that fits your problem. So these are also architecture agnostic. So that's another advantage. Now, this was like, you know, what we already did and what we have published. Now, there is a suboptimality in this process as well, which I will like, you know, talk about. And that's the extension that I'm presently like working on. So the suboptimality that lies in this particular model. Now I have just like, I'll explain these models very simply. Let's say I'll go to the previous one, it's easier. So as you can see that here, the averaging is like a simple unweighted average. That is, we are assigning equal importances to all the models. Now imagine a particular scenario where this model is more important for the prediction for the prediction for a particular input data, and these models are less important. In that case, when we are doing a simple average, we are essentially suppressing the output, but the important output that is coming out of this model, and amplifying the output that is coming out of these models. Although we are not explicitly amplifying or suppressing it by weights, but a simple average does not allow assignment of importance to the model that is more important. And in that respect, it is like actually suppressing the predictive response. So, and that is the suboptimality. And we simply want to remove that. And to do that, we actually rely on the mixture of experts framework from the ensemble learning. What happens there is that given a particular, let's say, input sequence, and here for the explanation, I'm assuming that, let's say, this time series sequences represent like running, jogging, and walking. And let's say we call each of our models a temporal expert. And let us assume that the first model is expert in detecting running activities. The second model is expert in detecting walking activities. And the last model is, let's say, expert in detecting jogging activity. Now, when we extract this temporal sequence from running, then we are expecting that this running model will actually be of more importance as compared to the other models. And that's what we want to do. And to do that, what we do is we simply train a neural network that helps us in assigning different weights to each of these models. So the neural network will take the same input that is being taken by each of the models, and then it will, based on like, and it will assign like certain weights to each of these model outputs. And then the final predictive output, which is average, will be a weighted average. And the backpropagation of the training will actually help in deciding the weights of this neural gate, such that during inference, when a particular input comes, it will help us in selecting the best combination possible of these models. So that's the goal of the whole framework. And that's what the neural gate achieves. So, I mean, like the architecture of neural gate is kind of quite simple. This is just to show you that, we are using an LSTM because there's a time series input, and the output of this neural gate will provide me with a a vector with n dimensions, a single dimensional vector with n outputs, where n represent the number of models, because this neural gate essentially will provide me the same number of outputs as there are the number of models in the ensemble, because the outputs will essentially help me weigh each of these models. So essentially that's like, quite simple and neat. And this neural gate is not a very, it's computationally very simple. It's a single layer LSTM with only 16 needs. At least that's the architecture that I've chosen for the data set. It runs very fast, because implementationally, if I come back to this framework and just talk about the implementational details just quickly. So each of these models, they are pre-trained, like they are trained separately. And once they're trained separately, they are deployed. And when they're deployed, this neural gate essentially will just, for a couple of examples, it will just learn how to assign weights. So these models are not, let's say that the weights of these models are not changed during this backpropagation, but the weights of this neural gate are only what that, that gets updated to the backpropagation. So these are like kind of frozen in a sense. And that's why, since it just learns how to weigh the outputs, I have seen that in the experiments, it does not take much time and much number of epochs to train the neural gate. It's just like a very fast training procedure, which takes a minute or so. And once you have the setup, you can use that as an inference. You can, of course, that goes without saying. Well, sorry, if you have any questions, you can actually stop and ask. Okay, cool, I'll continue. Yeah, as I was saying, in terms of if you think in terms of matrix operations, if the C is the number of classes, then each of these models provide you a C-dimensional vector, not a C-dimensional vector, but let's say a vector which, vector with C, let's say entries, where C represents the number of classes, of course, and all the ensemble will actually provide you with a C cross N matrix, where N represents the number of the models. So the goal of this neural network is to produce a n cross 1 vector, to learn an n cross 1 vector, such that the combination of this matrix and this vector provides you with an output that best fits your case. So essentially, this is our this is what goes into our final loss function to train the neural gate, which is trained with a simple cross entropy loss, which is like for the classification. So basically, that's like the matrix representation of this particular task. Geometrically, this is actually interesting interpretation, and I'll thank Banzish for this because we are kind of figured this out. Like he kind of motivated me to look into it from this perspective. So let's say that we have 3 classes in this example, and these are mutually orthogonal, of course, like because each of the softmax function will assign weights to one of them, but will suppress the other 2 in this 3-class classification problem. So the data will get clustered along one of these classes, so they're mutually orthogonal in some sense. Now, what happens is, let's say we have the output of a model is represented by this very single dotted lines. So let's say the output of the model 1 lies predicts that your softmax function is somewhere in between this class 1 and the class 3. Let's say the output of this model 3 predicts that your output is probably somewhere in between class 1 and class 2. And let's say the model 4 and the model 2 actually predicts that your output is closer to class 1. So intuitively, we can say that probably this class 1 is the correct output for this example when we are talking about an ensemble. Or let's say, since these 2 models kind of vote for this class 1. However, since the vectors of each of these models are kind of far away from the class 1 prediction, the resultant would be forced to be the resultant vector, which is in a case of a standard ensemble, will actually force this the resultant to be lie somewhere in between class 1 and class 3 because of the negative effect that is being accommodated from the model 1 and the model 3 vectors. However, in reality, this resultant should have been a bit closer to class 1 because the true prediction is class 1. Now, what we want to do is we want essentially learn the scaling factors, which we call weights, such that if this example comes, then we scale down the factor of the vector of model 1 and the vector of model 3, and we scale up the vector of model 4 and the vector of model 2, such that the resultant, which is called the resultant MoE, lies much closer to class 1. And this is kind of the geometrical interpretation so that the goal of this mixture of experts framework tries to achieve. We have actually ran our experiments on this PAM-up2 dataset, and we have used as our comparison, we have used the earlier framework that we defined. So essentially, what happened was we have our earlier ensemble framework, and we applied mixture of experts on top of that, and we also took another standard ensemble framework in this domain, and we applied mixture of experts framework on top of that as well. And in both the cases, we see an effective increase in the classification accuracy and the F1 score on the PAM-up2 dataset. The reason we have chosen this dataset is because it consists of a range of different activities which are, let's say, not very uniform in some sense. So there is a scope that we can actually have, arise to this scenario. Because imagine, if you are having very uniform, activities which does not require a lot of, which does not require the expertise of this. How do I say it? Let's say, if you have if you have a case where you don't need the ensemble because of this temporal windows which I was talking about earlier should not be different for each of the activities. In that case, it might happen that the mixture of experts framework does not yield any extra benefit, or for that matter, the ensemble does not yield any extra benefits. But for this data set, since the activities are we have a wide range of activity, it's actually a good data set to do the experiments. So these are the results we got, and for checking robustness of this method, we actually relied upon some statistical tests. I will of course not go into detail because I myself do not really understand a lot about these tests, but a professor from one of our courses actually instructed me to carry out these tests. I think you can actually look into this because this really gives you an intuition on whether your experiments are like, to be relied upon, or if the improvements that you have done over the previous state of the art are significant enough to be reported. So that's like, that's why you need to do this coherency test. And there is this two-tailed, I'll send the link to that, no worries. And finally, another interesting observation that we saw is for one of the state-of-the-art methods, which is called LSTM ensembles, they use 20 ensemble models to achieve a F1 score of 0.86 on the time up to data set without using the mixture of experts framework. However, if we use the mixture of experts framework, we see we can actually achieve this like even better result just with 5 models, because it helps us like, kind of prune the number of models from 20 to 5 in some sense, because when we are training with 20 models, or when we are combining 20 models, we do not really know whether like, all the models are important enough to be even accounted to be like, to make the prediction or not. However, when we go on pruning like the number of models from 20 to like, 15, 10, and 5, we see that just with 5 models, but with an effective combination, we can achieve a much nicer classification score on this particular data set. And also like, so the confusion matrix actually provides us with something very interesting. So especially look at this rope jumping activity, because this was a very challenging activity to classify, not because the activity itself is not, as we can imagine, it's probably easier than vacuum cleaning, but there are like, much lesser number of samples. So we can see that all entries in the confusion matrix are more or less alike, except probably like, standing and some other activities, but more or less like, so for example, even vacuum cleaning in the mixture of, these are the 2 interesting observations. So we can see that when we are like running this mixture of experts framework on a simple LSTM ensemble, which does not take into account the temporality, then we see that we cannot really do very well in this rope jumping and the vacuum cleaning activity, because maybe there are some models which are actually good in recognizing vacuum cleaning and rope jumping, but we are not taking them into account, or we are assigning equal importance to them. And that's why some of the model which have like, high rate of misclassification gets more importance, or not more importance, but rather overshadow the overall prediction. For that, we get a high misclassification in these activities. However, when we are considering a mixture of experts framework for each of these models, like we assign importances, and that enables the mixing of this rope jumping and this vacuum cleaning activity in a much nicer way, which actually makes the difference, I would say, for these cases, because these were a bit different. Rest of the things like 0.88, 0.991 are more or less the same, because these were easy set of activities to classify. Yeah, so finally, this work I actually proposed is I wrote a very short paper and submitted it to a conference here. So, and it is kind of proposed as an extension of the previous framework. And it like the training is kind of very simple, because you just need to train the neural network, the neural gate, which is very fast. And this is like kind of an overstatement as of now, because technically it can be applied to any time series framework, but as you know, like since the workloads will be different, we need to think about how we can spin off the problem in that direction. And yeah, so it has like, this is something like I was like writing in the discussion. It can be compared with the mixture of experts framework in this setting can be considered as partial bagging, partial boosting, and partial mixture of experts in a way. So let's say, yeah, with that, I think that's what I had to kind of say and present to you guys a very short presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or you can please go ahead. Thank you very much.